see everybody here this morning and all thawed out. At least I guess you're thawed out. So, good to be together. Before we get into class this morning, I've asked Tom Hall to lead us in prayer, so let's all bow our heads. Please turn your Bibles, if you will, to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11. We're going to try to finish up today. Well, in fact, I'm going to finish up today our discussion on John the Baptizer. Not going to say we're going to cover everything about him, but we're finishing up today. Okay, if you know what I mean. 3 weeks on him is probably at least 1 week longer than what I intended to. But we just really wanted to get the idea of what John did, how John ended up preparing the way for Christ, and the things associated with that. You know, we recognize that John was the forerunner of Christ, and John prepared the way in getting the disciples and getting the people in Judea and the surrounding area ready for Christ. John was very much a prophet, and very much the type of prophet like Elijah was. In fact, he's called the Elijah in different places, and is described as that. And so his coming into the world was, one, a sign of prophecy that God was coming, and also a sign that the time was near for Christ to come into the world. And, you know, John is highly regarded by the people. He's highly regarded by Christ. And, in fact, this text that we're looking at today is going to show some of that. John is at a place where he is in prison, and we know that eventually John is beheaded. We're going to look at that here in a little while if we get the chance to in Matthew 14. But John is in prison because he's preaching about the Herod at the time and the adulterous relationship that he's in, and he put John in prison to get him out of the way. And so John is in prison and kind of realizes his time is short on this earth. And I just have to kind of figure that anytime you come to a situation like that, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to reflect, aren't you? You're going to think. You're going to wonder, you know, what have I done and how has my life been and what has been the purpose behind all of this? And I believe that John's in one of those places. And John, in the text, sends message to Jesus and asks Jesus a question. And that's where we are in Matthew chapter 11. Starting in verse 1. It says, when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now when John heard in prison that about the deeds of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? And Jesus answered him, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have the good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. John, as we saw in the Gospel of John, first chapter, that John bore witness to the light, that John proclaimed Jesus. We also know that when John baptized Christ, that shortly after that, when he saw Christ, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God." John had been one of the greatest witnesses of Jesus in his early ministry. A lot of the people came to John. When they asked John if he was the Christ, he said, "No." And he said, "There's one coming after me that's so much greater than I am, I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals." And so John had spent his life pointing toward Christ, pointing toward building him up. And now here John is at the end of his life. He's in prison. He knows his time is short. And he sends message to Jesus. "Are you the Christ? Or are we to wait on somebody else?"
Why would John do that when he'd already made the statements, "Behold the Lamb," and the other things he had done, saying that now he wants proof? I mean, did he not know?
Yeah, Randy, I'm teaching the class. That was going to be my question in just a minute. So since Randy asked it, okay, why would he do such a thing after saying that? You want to come up here, Randy? No. You been there and done that? You got the T-shirt? Yeah.
There may have been several reasons, but I think one of the reasons, at least in my mind, draw attention to Christ.
Okay, number one, draw attention to Christ. Whether John knew that was the purpose or not, then that's what the ultimate purpose was. Okay. Anybody else want to? There's something else out there. Okay, he wanted John's disciples to see that. You know, he sent them, wanting them to get the information. Okay, I think there's a good possibility of that there as well. Anything else? Yes, Mark?
That Elijah had indeed come back in the spirit of God.
Okay, Elijah in the sense of, yeah, as far as, Elijah being similar to John, and that, that it was that time that for him to fulfill and finish what he was doing. What else? Yeah, there's a point that's looking forward, because knowing that it won't be too long till John is gone. Okay. I think all those are good things. Certainly, I do believe that there is. I don't know if the word doubt is right, but we like affirmation. Every one of us does. We like to be reassured that we've done the right thing. We've all sought that. We do something, we know it's right, but then we ask people, did I do the right thing? And I see a little bit of that being there, that here John is, he wants to know. He wants to be reassured. He wants to understand. Is what has happened been the right thing? Are you the one? Also, there may well have been a mix. You see, the disciples of Christ did not understand, and they were confused about the fact that Jesus' kingdom was not an earthly kingdom. And there may have been a little bit of that misunderstanding there in regard to John, that maybe Jesus didn't quite act exactly like John thought that he would. And John poses that question. And I don't believe it was because of a lack of faith. I really don't. But I do believe that there's an assurance thing that he wants to hear. And so, he asks this question for whatever motivation. We're not told specifically what the motivation is. But Jesus responds to John in a different way than he responds to other people that ask things out of a lack of faith. When his disciples ask something out of a lack of faith, Jesus usually gives them a hard time about it. Like, why are you doubting, or why do you lack in faith, or whatever. Jesus gives a direct answer to go back to John. And so I think that's why I don't believe it's really so much a lack of faith as it is just wanting to have the assurance. You know, here he is at the point in life where he's done about everything he's going to do except for die as a martyr. And I could see where you'd want to get that kind of information. Jesus gives an answer. You know, the interesting thing about the answer that Christ gives, I want us to look at that answer. Here's what the answer is. Go tell John what you hear and see. Did Jesus answer the question? What's the question? What's the question? Are you the Christ? Wouldn't the natural answer be yes? But that's not the answer Christ gives. He doesn't give him a straight up yes, but instead what Christ gives, he gives him a good answer, of course, but he gives him this answer. He says, go tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised. And the poor have the good news preached to them. Well, that's exactly it. Jesus, when asked, are you the Christ, didn't say, yes, I am. Instead, he says to John's disciples, look at the evidence. What does this evidence tell you about the answer to your question?
It's the same thing that Paul said in Hebrews 11:1 about faith. The faith is the evidence of things not seen.
Right, right. And of course, that's where we're going to be this coming Wednesday. Yeah, there's the substance that we bring about is we tap into, we believe in what we can't see, but we carry that out. We follow it. We live after it.
Depending on example, we might use parallel this to our lives. How Christ did not have to claim, I am the Christ. Same way it should be us as Christians. We should not have to claim, I am a Christian, by the deeds, the words out of our mouth, our interaction with others, our love for mankind,
Right.
and the love for God should be enough evidence that we don't have to spit out the words, I am a Christian, because our actions speak loud and clear, just like
Right.
Christ's actions speak loud and clear who he was. He was the Son of God.
Right. You're just as bad as Randy. That's exactly where I wanted to go. But if you didn't hear what Andy said, Andy is spot on, and this is where I'm heading on this, and he's right on as far as that goes. And what if we were asked the question, are you a Christian? And you'd say, yes. What about answering it like Christ answered it? And that's what Andy was saying. He said it very well. Are you a Christian? And then you say, well, let the evidence speak for itself. You know, are we doing the things that a Christian ought to do? Are we able to say, well, take a look at my life. Let the evidence speak for itself. And I think that's very good, and I think that's exactly right on. And that's where I want us to put ourselves into this text, that when somebody asks us, are you a Christian, can we let the evidence stand? You know, if you were put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough to convict you? You know, or would they have to throw it out for insufficient evidence? You know, that's a sobering thought to think about that. But, you know, we have looked at, over the last about 3 months, we've looked at lessons from the fruit of the Spirit. And each one of those are the things, and that text in Galatians 5 is what's the point of all of it? Well, if the Spirit is within us, if God's Spirit is within us, these are the things that should be coming out in our life. The love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Those are the things that we ought to be doing. And so, if anyone looks at us as a follower of Christ, as someone that is a spiritual person, what they ought to see is those things. If they don't see those things, then you can suppose that, hey, that's not good. You know, you go to buy fruit at the grocery store. What are some things you look for? What do you look for when you go find fruit? Firm, okay. No bruises. What's that? Lowest price. Yeah. You've eaten a rotten apple or two, haven't you? Well, we look for that sometimes, yeah, because we know sometimes there are certain, like there's hundreds of varieties of apples overall, and there's a bunch of them that are good. And so if this one particular variety is on sale this week, then hey, you know, I'll get that one over the other one. And so yeah. What's that?
I can't believe you used it, so I did.
Yeah. What else is there? You know, you look for maybe an advertisement. Okay. Yeah. Right. We all know what good fruit looks like. We definitely know what it tastes like. And we make sure of it. We want the evidence. We want to see. We've all looked at the advertisement, haven't we? And then gone to the counter and thought, it's all shriveled up. It came from where? You know how many thousands of miles that is, and think, it must have sat in the back of back of a truck the whole way or something. No. I don't think I want that. And so, the evidence, when you get to look at and investigate it, tells the tale. And what if we were able to show that witness? You know, there's a lot of people, a whole lot of people in our world right now, and maybe even some people we know that we would consider brothers or sisters in Christ, that would answer, yes, I am a Christian. But where is the evidence? And there's a lot of people in this world that like the idea of calling themselves a Christian. There's a lot of people that use that name, that use that title, because they want the benefits to go with it, but yet they don't want what really matters with it. They don't want the life of service. They don't want to be like Christ. They don't want to do the things that He did. They want to help other people. You see, are you the Christ? Well, Christ meant anointed one, meant Messiah, meant King. What does this King do? Look at the things that He did. You know, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up. Now, Jesus performed miracles. We get that. We understand that. We're not called or anything like that to do that. But Jesus did those things. And then also the good news is preached to the poor. What's kingly about all of those things? What's the focus of every one of those things? All those things are focused at other people, aren't they? The kingship of Christ is not about He's got an ivory throne in a golden palace way up on a hill. He has an army of 100,000 soldiers. That's not the evidence of His kingship, is it? The evidence of His kingship is what He's doing for other people. How He's serving, how He's helping, how He's showing compassion and kindness on the people in the world. We think of what makes one a powerful leader. It's having power behind them. But Christ's power was about what He did for other people. Yeah, he was right there with the people. He was right among the people, and certainly, Jesus was probably the most approachable leader ever, of any kind of leader. He was among the people, and if we are going to ever have an impact on the people, then we've got to be so approachable as well, and we've got to recognize that. And all of those things showed that he was that way. Well, and I'll say, sometimes that was the reason why people didn't see him as the Son of God. The Pharisees, the Sadducees said, but he's a friend of sinners. He eats with tax collectors. How can he be the Son of God? Well, he did that because he was the Son of God. And we need to recognize that too. Was there anybody that Jesus encountered that he was too good to be around them? Even Legion, who was demon-possessed, ran through the tombs and lived among the tombs naked, was as close to a certifiable wild man, out of his mind, would be locked up in some asylum if he were around today. Jesus had time for him. Made an evangelist out of him, because it goes back to the Decapolis and tells what Jesus had done for him. Nobody that Jesus encountered was too bad, too far gone for Jesus to spend the time to help them if they had the interest in being helped.
Ben, we could use the same list, realizing these are physical things that Jesus did by making the blind to see. But we have people who are blind to the gospel.
Yes.
Help see. And you can take all those, the lame to walk, someone that's struggling in their walk with Christ. There's a spiritual opportunity for us to work. You can take all those things and you can transform them over to a work that we can do.
Right.
And even use that as a guideline to help us to show
Yes.
we're Christians.
Yeah, exactly right. We can't heal the blind, but we can help people see, as in the truth, as in the understanding, and that's exactly right. You're right on with that. We can't do the miracles, but what can we do? And that's what we need to focus on, what we can do. And we can do those things. We can help people to see. We can help those that are struggling in one way or another. We can help them to be encouraged and find faith. The good news was preached to the poor, and we can certainly do that. And what a great thing it was. So we, as Christians, should let the evidence speak for who we are. We should let the evidence cry out about our actions and what we're doing. And we should help others to see and to know and to understand it. And that's what Jesus sent to John. Now, let's look on as we go through this text. Verse 6, Jesus said, "And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." Some people would be offended by Christ. Some people would be misunderstanding of Christ. And that was true. People still misunderstand Jesus. And what a blessedness, what a goodness it is to not be one of those that is. Jesus and his cross and the things that he did were offensive to some people. And whose problem was that? Well, it was theirs. It was their problem. And it's certainly the case today. And so we need to make sure that we not be among them. We need to make sure that we do what we can to help people not be offended by the cross, but instead humbled and brought to the cross. Verse 7. As they went away, meaning those disciples of John that go back to tell John what Jesus has said, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing. Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. But to what I compare this generation, it is like sitting in the market and calling to their playmates. We played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. Jesus ties together a lot of loose ends about John and about himself. He says to the people that are there, that are gathered around, the crowds, when they leave, when the two disciples of John leave, when his disciples go, he says, what did you go out to see when you went out to see John? Why did you go out to listen to him? Was it because he had fine clothing? Was it because he lived in a king's palace? You didn't go because of what clothes he wore. You didn't go because of even who he was. You went because of his message, because he was a prophet. That he was even more than a prophet. John was significant enough that they realized that anything John had to say they wanted to hear. And it was based upon his content, upon what he said. Not the package, not the persona. They didn't go because he had a big air-conditioned auditorium or heated auditorium. They went because John had something they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear what his message was. They went to him because he was more than a prophet. Jesus says about him that no one born of women, no one born of a woman was greater than he. But then he also, right after, said that anybody in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. How is that?
He's talking about Christians in the church, isn't he?
Yeah, he's talking about Christians in the church with the kingdom. He's referencing the fact of that John, what you look at with John is John had understanding and insight beyond anybody in the Old Testament. No one before John knew more than John. Because John knew the kingdom was at hand. John knew about what was coming. Did anybody before that? Well, they knew it was going to come someday, but John knew it was going to happen immediately. John knew it was there. And so John's blessedness, John's understanding, was greater than all that had come before him. But what about those that were going to come in the kingdom? Well, everyone in the kingdom is going to have greater blessings and greater understanding than even John would. See, because John died under the old law. John died not too long after this point. And so, even though John was greater than any before, all of those that would come later in the kingdom would be able to be blessed greater, be able to understand greater, and be greater because they're able to be a part of the kingdom that was coming. What a great thing it is that this was going to be. And Jesus said, you know, if you can understand it, if you can believe this, John is the one that was prophesied about. The truth about John pointed the light toward Christ. And because of that, he was recognized as the Elijah to come. And because of that, the people ought to know that the time was near. What a great thing it's said about John when Jesus talks to the others about him. And that's why I say I don't believe that John is coming from a position of doubt or a lack of faith. I see it more as just simply he wants assurance. He wants to know, he wants to bring light to Christ. And maybe he does want to teach his disciples something to help them understand about Christ. And so in so doing, he does all of that. He brings all of those things about. Jesus emphasizes the evidence. Jesus emphasizes the truth. And we should do the same thing. And recognize that John is the Elijah, the promised one that is to come. Any questions or comments on that so far? Yes, Mark?
Just one thing to bring to light while you're here. It's a perfect time because where does John come from? You get back to Adam and Eve when they were created. Were they created higher beings? Were they created as leaders? Was John a leader? Christ could have been announced by the Pharisees and been readily accepted by the Jews. That's not how God did it. John came from very humble means, and Christ came from very humble means. Even though he came from on high, he came up as low as any of us began.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting, especially in this story.
Yeah, John came from the way he did because of fulfilling the prophecies of that. But yeah, why would God choose such a lowly individual in that? Well, the thing about that is if Christ came down to this earth in all the majesty and power that he could have, that would have been so mind-blowingly intimidating that we couldn't accept it. You know, it was I'm not sure whether everybody was here or not, but here a few weeks ago, we talked about in the Sunday morning on gentleness and the fruit of the Spirit. And the first one of the things that we looked at in regard to gentleness is probably the greatest act of gentleness in all of human history is when God chose for his Son to come to the earth, he came as a baby, just like you and me. He came just like us. That of all the ways that Christ could make an entrance into the world, he came as a baby in the middle of the night to poor humble parents in what we would call a barn. Of all the entrances onto the planet, he came just like us. And so God chose a child for Christ to be born like all of us and to live a life like all of us. And what a great act of gentleness that was. And so, you know, Jesus comes that way. John came that way to ordinary parents. You know, that segues well into what I want us to look at here in verses 18 and 19. Jesus says about John, says John didn't come eating or drinking, they say, as a demon. You see, John lived out in the wilderness. He was non-social. Wouldn't say he was antisocial, but he was non-social. He didn't go to people's houses. He didn't go to the marketplaces. He didn't rub elbows with people. John was out there in the wilderness. The only reason why John had a crowd is because people went to him. The Son of Man, he came eating and drinking. He came rubbing elbows with people, going to wedding feasts, going to parties, going to the marketplace, going all these places. And you know what they said about each of them? John's demon-possessed. What did they say about Christ? He's a glutton and a drunkard. You know what's common about those two things? People are going to complain. You know, I think sometimes we get way too uptight when people don't like us and say things about us. We try too hard to get people to like us Because let's face it, you can be John the Baptizer, the one Jesus said is the greatest born among people. And people didn't like him. They said he was demon possessed. You could be the perfect, sinless Son of God, and people call you a glutton and a drunkard. How good do you have to be to not be called something bad? You can't do it. I can't do it. Some people are going to criticize in any and all situations. And you know what? Just because somebody makes the accusation doesn't make it true. Well, we've been duped by that one. I don't know how many times we've been duped by that one. You know, every time, I mean, there's not been many times in my life that I knew more behind a news story than what got put into the national news. But the few times that I had a clue as to what kind of things went on, the national news got it all wrong. I mean, did it frost anybody else? I mean, I didn't live in West Virginia at the time, but when they were talking about the mine disaster, the Sago mine disaster, and some of the things, some of the national news and all were saying about mining and mining accidents and other things, I'm like, those facts are totally wrong. They don't know anything about coal mines. They don't know anything about that. I'm like, they don't know anything. You know, and, you know, of course, you know, I lived in North Carolina at the time, and I'm like, you know, whoever these people they are, and even some of them were proposed to be experts, and I'm thinking, no, they don't know what they're talking about. Now, and then there have been some other things that, you know, I've kind of knew things from behind stories or whatever, just because, and the facts that get told are just all contorted. And then I think, well, what about every other subject that you don't know the behind story? And usually there's so many things that get contorted, distorted, and whatever. And then you think, can we really believe anything they tell us? And a lot of times you just kind of wonder, you know, about how bad the reporting is on so many levels. Well, so many things that have been accused, I'd say a lot of times just aren't right. And that was certainly the case with Christ. Jesus was not a glutton and a drunkard. John was not demon-possessed. But some people said that. People said that about them. So, you can be perfect, and people are going to say those kind of things about you. You know, Jesus, when he closes out the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, remember how he closed out the Beatitudes? He says, blessed are you when you're persecuted for righteousness' sake. And then he says, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. When I read that, I always think, okay, if you're persecuted for righteousness, you're in good company. Because the prophets got persecuted that way. John got persecuted that way, and Christ got persecuted that way. The apostles later on got persecuted that way. So if you're persecuted because you're doing what is righteous, then you're in a good group. Now, if you're persecuted because you did something wrong, well, then that's, you know, you're just getting what you deserve. But if you're persecuted because you're doing what is righteous, then you ought to expect that's part of the territory. Now, the flip side of that is if there's no persecution come your way, nobody gets upset at what you're doing, maybe you're not doing much. Because if we do the right things, if we serve God in the right way, somebody's going to take offense at that. And we need to recognize that. Okay.
We could even be John the Baptist today in the sense that John came to prepare the way for Christ's first coming. We could be the John the Baptist in the Christian age to be preparing the way for the second coming
Yeah, in a lot of ways, that's what we do. Our job is to point toward Christ, the true light. John pointed toward Christ, the light. We point toward Christ. John readied for Christ's ministry and life and death and on the cross and resurrection. And we prepare people for Christ to come back. And yeah, the parallel is very good there, that we have that opportunity. We have that role. It's the reason why we're called the light of the world. It's the reason why we're called the salt of the earth. It's because we need to help people connect with what is the ultimate, what is the true light of the world, and that being Christ himself. People said all these things about both Jesus and John, but what does it say? Wisdom is justified by her deeds, which means the truth wins out. The truth is proved in the end. The truth comes through. You think about all that was said and all that was done to Christ and all that happened, that truth and wisdom eventually won out. Not before a lot of trouble, not before a lot of difficulty, but truth and wisdom won out. And John's role was brought about to proclaim Christ. In Matthew 14, let's turn there very quickly. We don't have time to dive into this and look at it, but like I said, we're going to finish this today. I just want to read these verses without a lot of comment because of time. But this is the ending of John's life. Matthew 14, starting in verse 1. It says, "At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He is raised from the dead, and that these miraculous powers are at work in him.' For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife." Now, real quickly, Jesus is performing miracles and doing all kinds of things. And Herod hears about it and says, "Oh, that's John raised from the dead." And the reason why he's raised from the dead is because he killed him. And this is the account of John being killed. And so that's why it's kind of going backward in the text. Verse 4, "Because John had been saying to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.' And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, 'Give me the head of John the Baptist here on the platter.' And the king was sorry because of his oaths and his guests, and he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came, and he took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus." That was the end to John, and what a sordid, nasty story it was that brought about that. But John was faithful and true to the end. Next week, we're going to look, as we begin our study into the life of Christ, we're going to look at the birth of Jesus and the beginning of his life. So if you would, look at Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2 for that. Thank you.